How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiaga, coming to you guys here on day 2 of free agency, or the tampering days of free agency. It officially starts tomorrow, the new league year, which officially starts free agency. But in these last 2 days, there's been a lot of crazy moves. Hopefully, you guys have been able to regroup and get to know all these moves that have been going down. There's been a lot that have flown under the radar. And in today's episode, I'm going to try and go over some of that with the other stories I have in store for you guys today. One of them being the Panthers and the voices going around saying that they didn't put Bryce Young in a situation to succeed. I'll go on to that. I'll talk about Chris Jones's record deal that he signed with the Kansas City Chiefs before the first day of free agency. I know it seems like forever ago, but with all the deals that have been going on, but I wanted to touch on that. Then in the other half of the show, I'll regroup and I'll recap some of those free agent moves that I wanted to get to and I thought that were significant. A lot of big deals and a lot of players moving over to different teams. And to wrap up the show, I wanted to talk about the Vikings. A lot has been going on with them. They made a lot of moves, a lot of new additions to their team, but as well, they also lost Kirk Cousins, which is a huge piece. And I wanted to pop up the question, are they better or are they worse now in terms of the additions, the departures? All that is coming up on today's show. A great show planned for you guys today. And before I jump into the first segment, as always, I want to remind you guys, if you have any questions, any comments that you want to make during the live show, to please use the tip and donations link running across the ticker below me. The tip and donations link is GSMCPodcast.net. Again, the tip and donations link is GSMCPodcast.net. This just makes sure I'm able to see your question over to my right on the chat box. It's a lot more fun, in my opinion, if you guys are commenting, engaging with whatever I have to say, agreeing, disagreeing with it. It's all welcome. It makes the show a lot more fun, and it's a huge help for the show if you're able to also donate, not only this show, but for all the shows across the network, and it's greatly appreciated every time you guys are able to do that. But in saying that, I can jump into the first story, the chip shot story of the day, being about Bryce Young and the Panthers. I read an article, and there's been more reports about it now, more people have touched on it, that Bryce Young and the Panthers, specifically the team, the organization, didn't create the ideal environment for Bryce Young to thrive in his rookie year. And sources, ESPN David Newton said that a source said Bryce really didn't stand a chance, said a source with direct knowledge of what was going on over there in Carolina, according to ESPN's David Newton. And my initial reaction for what I think about just that statement, he didn't stand a chance. The Panthers, not really the ideal scenario for him to go to. And right off the bat, my initial reaction is, isn't that what all first round, or first pick, I should say, quarterbacks or players kind of go into? Depending on who the team is, it's usually always, or it's supposed to be, the worst team getting the best player in the draft, to create more equilibrium with all the teams in terms of skill level, ability, and stuff like that. They get the first pick. So to bring in the player, to think this team was in a position where Bryce was going to succeed right away and have a type of year that CJ Stroud did have, I think is a little far-fetched, because I think just looking at the two teams before they were drafted, I would probably say that a lot of people had the Texans being the better team overall than the Carolina Panthers. Just before CJ Stroud got there, they had Davis Mills, this being the Texans, but they also had Nico Collins. I know Devin Singletary was still there, but other than that, they had Nico Collins. Dalton Schultz was signed last year, so he technically didn't play enough games with them to see what he really was with them, but he was signed. Then you had a defense that had some good players on it, and then there were some that you weren't really too high on just yet. Derek Stingley was there. Still very young in the league, but he was a high prospect that was drafted by them. Steven Nelson and all these other players like that, Blake Cashman. they were solid players, but you didn't really know what they were going to be. But compared to the Panthers, you look at them and you see Brian Burns. Okay, they brought in Adam Thielen, but then other than that, you can't really name a standout player that was on the Panthers, and it's having that and then seeing how it all turns out. In my opinion, I'm not too surprised because of all that I just said, and in terms of just the Panthers situation hasn't been good, so to say, for a lot of years now consecutively. Probably since Cam Newton, if you're being really honest, they haven't been a very good competitive team. For a kid like Bryce Young to come in, regardless of how successful he was in college with Alabama and how good he was, you can only do so much with the team that the Panthers put out there. And then just reading down further in the article, it said that David Newman continued to report on it, and he said there was a difference in philosophy between Frank Reich, offensive coordinator Thomas Brown, and O-line coach James Campen. And if you're put yourself in Bryce Young's shoes, if you're coming in, you already don't know really what's going on in the NFL. You have to know through experience to kind of develop your routines, develop the kind of relationship you have with these coaches, with the fellow players in the locker room. You have to develop into that leader to command the offense like most good quarterbacks in this league develop into. You have all of that on your plate, and then on top of that, you have the head coach saying one thing in your ear, the offensive coordinator saying something completely different or just slightly different, and then the O-line coach maybe not communicating directly with the quarterback, but with the offensive line, potentially communicating something else pretty differently or slightly different. All of that is just a recipe for disaster for Bryce Young. There's no way he could have had any right frame of mindset to focus on football and focus on developing if he has 2 to 3 different guys telling him different things, focusing on different things, and him not really sure where to allocate all of his attention to, where to get better at, because I think he is a good player. Just Dave Canales, the new head coach now this season, has said that, it's really his mentality, the kind of character that he is, in big games, small games, regardless of the games, he said that he always had the same expression. He was very cold-blooded, were his words, just from the initial interactions that they've had just this season. And I do believe that. I've seen him in college have great games, have just really good performances because of his ability, because he's not the biggest guy. I think it has forced him to elevate his abilities a little bit more. And I was disappointed with how he played, but, with all these reports coming out, all the coaches saying different things to him, offensive line not great, they don't have a lot of weapons. Thielen turned out to be a very good player, surprised a lot of people early on, but then he kind of died off, and you didn't have a number 2 receiver really at all to kind of take the weight off of Adam Thielen. And already Bryce Young was feeling pressure just trying to find Thielen. Once you take him away, it got very ugly. And overall in the season, Bryce Young finished with less than 60% completion percentage, threw for 2,800 yards, 11 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions. And the Panthers went 2-15. Frank Reich was fired after 11 games where they won 1 game and lost 10 of them. So take all that I just said, wrap it up, and then add on that the head coach is now gone and you have another guy coming in to try and implement some ideas to just get you guys through the rest of the season. And at some point you have to think, if you're Bryce Young, you don't want to say it, but it's realistic to think that he might have just checked out with the kind of success that they're having. At some point, I would probably assume probably by the 10th game, maybe even earlier than that he just realized, this isn't the situation. A lot of players probably realized that. If not Bryce Young, then maybe other veteran players that have been there, they're starting to believe, this is how it goes every year. So we kind of are used to not being in any sort of playoff contention by this point anyways. Let's just ride it out and just continue like we've always had. And Bryce Young's out there trying to prove himself, and you have all these guys not really in the right frame of mindset. It's all not adding up to a successful team. And I know other players, quarterbacks that were drafted number 1 overall have had similar situations in bad teams, but it hasn't really been reported too much as this one has, or I haven't been engaged enough back then to see it. This is like the first time where you're seeing Bryce Young on these reports coming out about him, and the attention being put on the organization more so than him. Because I think a lot of people have agreed with what I'm saying. They don't believe Bryce Young's just a bad player. If these reports are coming out, a lot of the attention is going on the Panthers, and a lot of pressure will still be on them until they get it right. Now they're transitioning over to Dave Canales, a new head coach. It's his first time being a head coach, and he kind of rose through the ranks pretty quickly. He had a great season last year. He got the best out of Baker Mayfield in their offense, but at the same time, how much of it was scheme, how much of it was the talented players that they had on offense, because Baker's a good player, already has experience in this league. Bryce is just going into his second year, so how is that dynamic going to work with Dave Canales not trying to work with Bryce Young? Compared to the Bucs, you have Mike Evans, who is an all-time great receiver, Chris Godwin, who's a solid number 2, Rachaad White, who stepped up a lot this year and had almost like a breakout year, if you want to qualify it as that. But the Panthers are way below that kind of skill level, and they have players, Chuba Hubbard, Miles Sanders, but they're not really up to par with the kind of skill set that's around the league right now. They both failed to average 4 yards per carry. Thielen was the only receiver to have more than 550 yards at 33 years old. Barely had 550 yards, and that's really nothing when you're thinking about a good, bona fide wide receiver one. That, to be honest, 550 yards is what you would expect out of a number 2 receiver, maybe a number 3 receiver, and Thielen was the best one. He was supposed to be a number 3 and number 2. You're expected to have a better one, but that wasn't the case, and now they're at this point, and they don't even have a first-round pick next year, so how's that going to work? You expect them to be more active in free agency. You hope to see that for Bryce Young's sake, but at the same time, how much better can they get? They can only get better, honestly. Being very honest, they can only get better. It's going to be very hard to be worse than what they were, but what's going to quantify success for Dave Canales and Bryce Young to really invest in this project that you have going on right now, because you don't have a first-round pick like I mentioned. You traded it to the Bears, and now they have it this year again because the Panthers had the worst record. The Bears have the number 1 pick again, so you're already handcuffed that way, but you do have the chances of going after someone in free agency. They haven't really signed a wide receiver or a skill position player yet, but they have beefed up that offensive line, signed Robert Hunt, and I know they signed another guard. I just can't remember his name. So that's good. That's positive to see, but you need a lot more than that. I expect them to be a bit more active, maybe trying to trade for a guy like T. Higgins. I don't know how much value you have to trade away, but that's a good sign. If you can pay him a lot of money, which the Panthers do have, he would fit in great with Bryce Young, and then maybe try and draft a guy in the second round if that works out well for you. But that's kind of where it's all at with Bryce Young. Not surprised that it didn't work out, because if you really look at this team, how could you tell me you expected anything differently? It is just a bit surprising, I think, for a lot of people to find out now, some of these things from a source saying he never stood a chance. That's always going to catch headlines, and I think that's why it's gotten a lot more attention. But it does hold some truth. But again, you can't be surprised by it, quite honestly. So the Panthers have a lot of work to do. I do have faith in Bryce Young. I do like Dave Canales, but you do have to see how he goes through his own growing pains as the season goes on in his first year being a head coach. But anyway, that allows me to move on to the second topic, or I should say the first break of the show. And then after the first break of the show, I have a lot more stories to get to with you guys. The Chris Jones record deal with the Kansas City Chiefs, keeping him around for another 5 years. A recap of some of the other moves in free agency that have happened, some pretty big ones. And then towards the end, more of a discussion topic about the Vikings and how good are they really now, a day removed from free agency, losing Kirk Cousins but getting a lot of other players on the defensive side. So don't go anywhere. You're not going to want to miss all those stories coming up on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.